Hello, class. So we're back and we're thinking about a paper written by a Lithuanian gentleman, Vitis Valatka, titled Creative Visualizations of Ethical Principles of Ancient Greek Cynicism and Their Significance to Modern Society. And so here he's looking at two ethical principles of ancient Greek cynicism, the vicious chase of pleasures, and the virtuous radical temperance. And so first thing to think of is the ancient Greek philosophy of cynicism, starting in the 5th century BC with Antisthenes and Diogenes as being a competing school to, say, Stoicism and likewise Epicureanism. And like Stoicism, Epicureanism, and virtue ethics, and also to an extent natural law theory, we're thinking of these philosophies, ancient Greek philosophies, as being eudaimonic. In other words, they are teleological. They are goal-oriented toward living a good life. So they are goal-oriented toward eudaimonia. They are goal-oriented toward living a happy life, okay? So in that sense, we should see them as, yes, they were competing schools of philosophy. However, they were not opposed to one another, so to speak. So they're just different ways of approaching the practical goal of living, and so they just had different ways of going about the way to help people live a better life. Okay, and so we're thinking of cynicism, and seeing that as starting in the 5th century BC. And so our Lithuanian philosopher is wanting us to consider the way that we're thinking of creativity. And so creativity has to do with innovation and likewise a new understanding of an old problem. And so in the context of, say, environmental ethics, that's key, because if we're thinking of creative visualization, it sounds like it's this esoteric, new age way of approaching things, but what I think is really key is once we recognize that, well, we already have a creative visualization of what it means to consider the world without the threat of climate change, let's say. Or we also have we want to have a creative visualization of how it is that we're understanding the problems of population, or the problems of pollution, or emissions reduction, reducing our carbon footprint, understanding new ways of eating, understanding new ways of consuming, right? That we want a creative way to visualize a world that is that has less pollution for future generations, that sort of thing. Okay, so it's not as esoteric as it sounds on the surface, and so understand that ancient Greek cynicism is to be contrasted with contemporary way that we understand cynicism. And so our contemporary understanding of cynicism is such where we think that it's usually a negative when we say someone is being cynical. In other words, we think of cynicism as the distrust of someone's integrity. So that is to be contrasted with the ancient Greek tradition of cynicism, whereby we're understanding cynicism there to be a distrust of civilization, or the type of civilization that takes us away from the essentials of what it is to be human, okay? And so that's more positioning how we're understanding ancient Greek cynicism. So that's rather different from our contemporary understanding of it as something where we're distrustful of someone's integrity. And so Volotka is wanting us to have a way of understanding cynicism by way of so-called cynical ethics. And so one thing that we're wanting to do is, if we are thinking of a life stripped away from all that distracts us in terms of pleasure. So in other words, contemporary society has us geared toward pleasure seeking, and that pleasure seeking takes us away from that which is essential to living, okay? And so a cynic is cynical of a lifestyle that takes us away from the essentials of living. And so that's what's meant by the so-called vicious surplus of pleasures. So our contemporary society has us geared toward a vicious surplus of pleasures. He gives the example of a flywheel, as far as some of you might understand the dynamics of a flywheel in mechanical engineering as being a way of bringing about the kinetic energy of the flywheel. But I think that's actually more distracting, and it's easier to think of the problem of slavery. So, in other words, the way that we're thinking of slavery is that when we have an excess of pleasure-seeking means of living life, we will find ourselves becoming enslaved to that lifestyle, because when we are able to get pleasure, we usually want more of it, and as a result become enslaved to it, to the degree that that enslavement takes us out of our what it is to be essential, or what it is to be essentially human. So our slavery toward pleasure takes us out of, or distracts us from, what it is to live essentially for the cynic. And so that's what we're wanting to focus on, right? And so that's why slavery is such a good example. I can't think of how a flywheel works in relation to this metaphor, and I'm not going to get too distracted with that. So then we can think of pleasure as pleasure seeking as a way to lose control by way of becoming enslaved to it. Okay, and so what we want to do is take our lives away from that. And so that points us to this idea of cynicism as being an ascetic practice. In other words, you're stripping life down to its essentials and focusing on what is essential rather than what is excessive. Okay, it's said that Diogenes once noticed a child drinking water with their hands. So in other words, cupping their hands and drinking water like that. And Diogenes then destroyed the only possession he had at the time, which was a cup. So anyway, and so that shows you how he's wanting to strip life down to its bare essentials. Okay, and then so that's the first ethical example. So our first ethical example is seeing that contemporary society has us geared toward living a life of pleasure into excess, and so visualizing slavery helps us understand a way out of that vicious cycle of pleasure, that vicious surplus of pleasure. And so there's an ethical framework there that we could understand in terms of visualization. And so we could easily see that in terms of consumer culture. We become enslaved to our pleasures by way of consumer culture, and that visualization of enslavement helps get us away from that, is the point, right? And then we have the virtuous radical temperance, which is the positive way that we're understanding ethics there, to the degree that we want to be temperate. And so, in other words, we want to be prudent. So what we're wanting to do is key into our natural temperance to get us to a life that is virtuous. So a life that is virtuous is one that is temperate, one that is prudent. And that prudence is minimizing our appetites as a way of enhancing our temperance. So in other words, the citizen of the cosmos, the cynic. So Diogenes claimed to be the so-called cosmopolitan, the citizen of the cosmos. And so the citizen of the cosmos is not constrained by pleasure seeking, but is rather prudent to be virtuous as a means of becoming happy in life, as a means toward so-called eudaimonia, and seeing wealth, fame, and power as surplus pleasures to draw away from, okay, and to be prudent with, okay. So in other words, the myth of Prometheus stealing fire from the gods was seen as negative for the cynic, because the way that's understood is that the Titan Prometheus was giving fire to humans. Did I just say giving fire to the gods? I meant Prometheus was giving fire to humans. He bestowed fire to humans, as the myth goes. And for the cynic, this is a problem because it's giving man a way to have a surplus of pleasures, right? It's giving man too many comforts, is the idea for the cynic. And so that's drawing man away from our prudence and what is essential to living, okay? So that's a good start on cynicism, and we'll take it from there. So thank you. Bye-bye.